guys, how are you? I hope you're all doing very well. This afternoon I'm going to be doing a movie review. This movie is a horror anthology from Germany, German language English subs, released in the year 2015, directed by George Bucharest, Mikhail Kozakowski and Andreas Marschall, and this film is called German Angst. So German Angst is separated into three stories. You've got the first story of this girl who lives in an apartment by herself in Berlin. She's got these pet guinea pigs, and she's constantly comparing the guinea pigs to humans. And then what we don't know is that she has a man that is tied to her bed that she systematically tortures. The second segment is about this Polish couple. They're going through an abandoned warehouse in Germany, and they come across these neo-Nazis who take them captive and they start torturing them. But what the Nazis don't realise is that this couple are in possession of this ancient artifact that allows the tables to be turned, and in fact the Nazis are going to go from the the bad guys to the actual victims. So then the third story is about this guy who goes through a very seedy Berlin sex club. He is approached by this old man who allows him to go into this secret club, and basically the secret club allows this guy to act out his wildest fantasies, but at the same time the drugs that he has to take are going to have grave side effects, and it's going to lead him down a living nightmare. So what all these stories add up to and how it all unfolds is something you're going to have to find out for yourself, because that's as far as I'm going with my synopsis. Now my thoughts on German Angst. Coming into this film, I did have my expectations. Now this is a horror anthology that is directed by the three most shocking directors to ever come out of Germany. So for that reason, I was expecting just something very shocking for the sake of being shocking. A lot of these extreme horror films, they're very lazy, and they really build themselves on the fact that who can be the most shocking, who can be the most devastating as far as violence, rape, nudity, just really excessive sort of material. And it really doesn't leave anything to the imagination, and it's not really that in-depth. And that's exactly what I was expecting from German Angst. But what I got from German Angst was a film that was a lot better than I was expecting. I thought this was actually quite emotional. It was actually quite in depth in some of the segments, and it actually makes you think. And I really like the idea that this had on German Angst. It shows you really broken people, broken situations, cruelty, just the ugliness of humanity as a contradiction of the beauty of nature. You got a very good looking film in this one. The cinematography is excellent. The score is very haunting and beautiful, but that beauty is contradicted by the ugliness of mankind. And I think the most scary thing about this film is that these are human beings doing horrible things to other humans, that it doesn't take place in the realms of the paranormal. This isn't a vampire, this isn't a zombie. You can't disconnect yourself from the material that you're actually seeing, and this is what makes it that scary, because this is in the realms of possibility, and it does show you the ugliness, and it's the ugliness that's not making any apologies, and it's the ugliness that you would expect from directors who are willing to go that extra step to make you feel uneasy. And that's exactly what I got from German Angst. Very, very uneasy. The brutality is very hard to watch, especially in the second segment. I was just shocked on what these poor, Polish couple were going through. These Nazis were very, full of hate, but then towards the end of that segment, you get a little bit of an insight into what's going on, and it makes you think, and it makes you realise, these things actually happen. And then the last segment is very surreal, very nightmarish, and I really like the way that that kept my eyes glued to the screen. The visuals are just very hypnotic, and it actually demands your attention. By the end of this film, you don't realise that it's gone for 105 minutes as far as a feature is concerned. So I really like the second and the third segment, but my problem with the film was the first segment, which I'll go into a little bit later. But as I said, if you are a fan of horror anthologies, then I definitely would recommend German Angst, because it does have quite a bit of soul searching, and it is very relevant to today's society. So I really like the idea that each short story had a life of its own. The first story was very much a psychological horror. The second story was just absolute torment, and then the third story was a fantasy sort of surreal feel. And I really like the way that these directors they took their own style, so it wasn't just copying each other, and it wasn't just splashing excess for the sake of it. There is some very graphic material, but there's also a little bit in it that leaves it up to your imagination, which is something that psychological horror fans will really appreciate. I also like the fact that each story exhausts all of its possibilities, meaning that it doesn't leave room to expand into a feature film. A lot of these horror anthologies, you think to yourself, okay, that segment would have been really good as a feature film, because there's a lot of areas that it didn't expand onto a satisfactory level, and you feel that it didn't really understand what a short story is all about. Basically, a short story, you get to the basis very quickly, and you cap it off, and you tie up all loose ends, and you think to yourself, okay, I don't need to know more. And I actually thought all three of these directors really nailed it, because I didn't need to know more, because everything was explained in that very short time frame. And a lot of these horror anthologies don't really understand the anthology. It doesn't really understand what a short story is, but I thought German Angst really understood what that was. So that was another thing that really surprised me and took me off guard. Unfortunately, however, there are problems to the film. Now, as I said, the cinematography is very well done, very professional. Actually feels like it had a little bit of money behind it, but that is contradicted by the fact that the acting is not very good and the dubbing is not very good. Now, what I mean by that is that in the second and third segments especially, there is some English, and the English actually sounded dubbed, especially in the last segment. The main character, his voice, it sounded like it was dubbed, and therefore it wasn't coming across naturally, and you could really, you actually felt that it was very amateurish, and so that amateurish quality in the acting and the dubbing didn't meet the professional quality in the cinematography. So you felt that it was very disjointed, and there were a lot of moments in this film I actually thought it was a missed opportunity, because it should have been a great film, but unfortunately there were little aspects in the movie that didn't work, and it felt out of place, and it just made the film very disjointed, and that's what I didn't like that as well. Another problem I had with the anthology aspect was the fact that it doesn't really combine to make an overall piece. Now, anthologies such as Pulp Fiction, you've got Trick or Treat, which is a horror anthology. All those movies, they feel like they're not necessarily different films. They're different aspects. They're different points of view. They're different perspectives within one whole story. And they all intertwine. They all cross roads. And you feel that although you're watching three separate stories, it is definitely the same film. And then at the end of it, you think you just watched one big movie. And I think that's what Pulp Fiction did so well. And as I said, what Trick or Treat did so well. But this movie, it doesn't have that. It very vaguely connects all of it together through German angst. You know, very horrible people doing horrible things, that hatred of humanity. But it definitely feels like three separate stories. So you feel, okay, I'm just watching these short stories, and they're not combining to make what makes an anthology horror film very good. And that to me was the biggest disappointment with German angst. And I felt that if it had a little bit more of a plan in order to basically round up all of these movies to make it one big film, it would have been a lot better. Unfortunately, again, there is another problem to this movie, and that problem is the George Bucharite, his segment. Now, a lot of people love George Bucharite. I haven't actually seen any of his films, but I've heard a lot about him. So for that reason, that was the selling point for German Angst. That's the reason why I wanted to see this film. But I was bitterly disappointed by his segment, and I'm sure a lot of his fans are going to be as well. I thought this is lackluster. I thought it was by far the weakest segment of the story, of the whole film. I thought that it lacked motivation. He didn't have any passion in this, and it felt like he was just making this film and is going to sell the film based on the fact that his name is behind it. And so as fans of George Bucharite, you're going to expect a standard that never comes. You know, there's expectations that this guy is very well known in the extreme horror community. The fact that his is the weakest was definitely the most disappointing aspect of this film, because I'd never heard of Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Andreas Marschall, but those two films were by far the best, and I just thought that was very disappointing coming from a guy that I expected so much more from. So the first story is by far the weakest. It does set it on a very bad tone. You know, I thought to myself, okay, it's just going to go downhill from here, but thankfully the second and third segment prevent the ship from sinking, and as a result of that, if you are a fan of horror anthologies, I would recommend German Angst. Be very careful. It is extremely brutal. The gore is there, and it's everything they'd expect from three very shocking horror directors. But I thought if there was a little bit of tweaking here and there, it could have been a lot better than it was. But having said that, it's still certainly not a bad film by any stretch of the imagination. So overall, for German Angst, going to give it 3 stars. Go out there and see it. Alright guys, that's it for my review. Hope you enjoyed it. Till next time, keep watching movies, and I'll see you later.